Have you ever noticed how heavy a thought can be? It weighs nothing on a scale, yet it can feel like you are carrying a mountain on your shoulders. It keeps you awake. It keeps you tight. It keeps you from the peace you deserve. I'm glad you're here. If you are listening to this, it's likely that your day has been long, or your mind is busy. Perhaps you are replaying conversations, worrying about tomorrow, or simply feeling a tension you can't quite name. That is okay. You don't need to force it to stop. And if you feel like it, you can gently let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes, it's comforting to realize how many of us are quietly sharing this same moment from different corners of the world. You see, the mind is like a guardian dog. It barks at shadows because it wants to protect you. We don't need to yell at the dog to be quiet. We just need to gently let it know that we are safe, so it can lay its head down and rest. For the next hour, I am going to share a collection of stories with you. These aren't just fairy tales. They are mirrors. Some are from the Zen tradition, some from Stoic philosophy, and some are simple metaphors for the human experience. Each story revolves around two things: the art of letting go and the discovery of your inner strength. You don't need to memorize these stories. You don't even need to listen to every word. If you drift off to sleep in the middle of a sentence, that is perfect. That is the goal. Think of my voice as a gentle breeze. You can enjoy it while it's there, but you don't need to hold on to it. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let's begin with our first journey, a journey about the weight we choose to carry. By the time Rachel reached the parking lot, the rain had already decided what kind of night it was going to be. Not a storm, not anything dramatic, just steady rain falling straight down, soaking everything without asking permission. She paused beside her car keys, still in her hand, watching water slide across the windshield in thin, uneven lines. Her jacket was already damp at the shoulders. She could feel the cold beginning to seep in, the kind that doesn't shock you, just slowly settles. Rachel was 39, a single mom, an office administrator who spent most of her day holding things together quietly. Schedules, requests, small crises that weren't hers but somehow landed on her desk anyway. By the time she clocked out, she felt emptied out in a way that sleep alone didn't always fix. She opened the car door and sat down, closing it with a dull, heavy sound. The rain drummed softly on the roof, not loud, not gentle, just constant. For a moment, she didn't start the engine. She rested her forehead lightly against the steering wheel, eyes open, watching the wipers drag water aside only for it to return again. Clear, blurred, clear, blurred. That's what the day had felt like. Her mind replayed the small things: a missed call from her son's school, a comment from her supervisor that wasn't criticism but wasn't reassurance either, a to-do list that kept rearranging itself no matter how many boxes she checked. None of it was unbearable. All of it together felt heavy. Rachel sighed and leaned back into the seat. The rain didn't stop. It didn't respond to her mood. It didn't speed up or slow down because she needed a break. And oddly, that helped. Rain had a way of doing that, reminding her that not everything was reacting to her effort. Some things were simply happening whether she managed them or not. She turned the key. The engine came to life with a low hum. The heater kicked in slowly, air still cool at first. She reached up and wiped a small circle on the windshield with her sleeve, then stopped. The glass fogged again almost immediately. No point fighting it. Rachel let the wipers do their steady work. Back and forth, back and forth. Each pass cleared the view just enough to see the painted lines on the asphalt shining faintly under the lot lights. Driving home in the rain always made time stretch. Traffic slowed. Everyone moved more carefully. There was less urgency in the air, as if the world itself had decided to ease up. As she pulled out of the lot, Rachel noticed how the rain softened the edges of everything. Streetlights blurred into warm halos. Brake lights smeared into red reflections on the road. The usual sharpness of the city faded. She didn't have to see far ahead, just the car in front of her, just the curve of the road. Fear often showed up for Rachel like this, not as terror, but as accumulation, a sense that if she wasn't careful, something would slip. Something would go wrong. Someone would need her, and she'd be one step behind. But the rain didn't ask her to hurry. It soaked the road evenly, washing dust into the gutters, dulling the sharpness of the day. She remembered standing in rain as a kid, hating the wet clothes, loving the smell afterward. The way everything felt quieter once the rain passed. Rachel loosened her grip on the steering wheel. She hadn't noticed how tight it was until her hands relaxed. The car moved steadily forward. No skidding, no drama, just motion. The rain didn't fix anything. It didn't solve her problems. It didn't rearrange her responsibilities. But it changed the texture of the moment. And sometimes that was enough. She turned onto her street windshield wipers, still keeping rhythm, and felt a small, unfamiliar sense of relief. Not because things were suddenly better, but because she wasn't fighting the weather anymore. The rain could fall. The road could be wet. Her day could be heavy, and she could still make it home. By the time Rachel pulled into her driveway, the rain had softened into something quieter. It still fell, but more patiently now, as if it had said what it needed to say and was content to keep going without attention. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of cooling metal. The rain tapping gently on the windshield. The house in front of her looked dim and familiar. One porch light glowing like it always did. Nothing about it promised answers. It just promised shelter. Rachel stepped out of the car and felt the wet ground beneath her shoes. The air smelled clean in a way it hadn't earlier, washed of dust and heat. She didn't rush. If her jacket got wetter, that was fine. It wasn't something she needed to fix right now. Inside, she kicked off her shoes by the door and hung her jacket on the back of a chair. A small puddle formed on the floor beneath it. She noticed it, then decided to leave it for later. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, just paused. She moved through the living room, turning on a lamp instead of the overhead light. The softer glow made the space feel gentler, as if the day had loosened its grip the moment she walked in. She filled a glass with water, took a slow sip, then another. Rain had a way of doing this, not erasing what came before, but rinsing it, letting the sharp edges dull. letting things settle where they landed instead of scattering them further. Rachel sat down on the couch and leaned back, listening to the distant sound of rain through the walls. It was muffled now, almost like a memory of sound rather than the thing itself. Her shoulders dropped a little, then a little more. The worries from earlier didn't disappear. They were still there somewhere. Tomorrow would still come with its questions. Her responsibilities hadn't changed shape just because it rained. But the fear that usually wrapped itself tightly around those thoughts had loosened. She noticed how fear often tried to rush her to solve, to plan, to imagine outcomes before they arrived. It liked to stay ahead of time, as if being prepared meant being safe. But tonight, the rain had slowed everything down enough that rushing felt unnecessary. The future could wait outside like the rain itself. Present, but not pressing. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. Not to escape, just to rest them. Her breath found its own rhythm, longer on the exhale, quieter on the inhale. She didn't adjust it. She didn't guide it. She let it be what it was. There was a strange comfort in realizing that change didn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it came like rain, inconvenient, unwelcome, unavoidable, and then quietly did its work. The road outside had been dusty before. Tires kicked up grit. Wind carried it everywhere. Now it lay darker, smoother, easier to drive on. The rain hadn't asked whether the dust wanted to leave. It just passed through. Rachel opened her eyes and looked around the room again. Everything was still where she left it. The couch, the lamp, the faint reflection in the window. But something inside her had shifted just enough to notice. She stood up, turned off the lamp, and let the room return to shadow. The house didn't need to be perfectly dry. The day didn't need to be perfectly understood. In the bedroom, she lay down without checking her phone, without rehearsing conversations or scanning tomorrow's list. The rain outside continued steady and unbothered. If fear was imagination reaching too far ahead, then peace, she realized, might be this, allowing the moment to be exactly what it was, without adding more weight to it. The rain would stop when it stopped. The road would dry when it dried. Tomorrow would arrive when it arrived. For now, there was nothing she needed to outrun, nothing she needed to solve. Just the quiet work of letting the day be washed clean enough to rest. And as the rain carried the last of the dust away, Rachel let the night carry the rest. The leaf had been there longer than Susan expected. It clung to the bare branch outside her window long after the others had let go. Day after day, the tree stood almost empty, its limbs thin against the sky, while that one leaf remained brown at the edges, curled inward, still attached. Susan noticed it one quiet afternoon when she sat by the window with a book she wasn't really reading. The light was soft, the kind that only comes late in the season. Not warm, not cold, just tired. She was 62 now, a librarian for most of her life. Someone who had learned to love slow things, pages turning shelves, settling the low hum of a building holding its breath. Change had never frightened her loudly. It arrived for her in subtler ways. Retirements, empty desks, names that stopped appearing on holiday cards. The leaf didn't move much. Even when the wind came through it, only trembled slightly, as if unsure whether it was ready. Susan found herself watching it longer than she meant to, wondering what kept it there. She told herself it was just biology. A stronger stem, a sheltered angle. Nothing poetic about it. And yet, she kept looking. Later that evening, she stepped out onto the porch, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. Somewhere nearby, crickets began their steady rhythm, not loud, not shy. The tree stood just a few steps from the porch railing. Up close, the leaf looked thinner than she'd imagined. Fragile, almost translucent where the light passed through. Susan reached out not to touch it, but to steady herself against the railing. She remembered autumns from years ago when her husband would rake leaves into uneven piles and complain about how they never stayed where he put them. She smiled faintly at the memory, then felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when a thought didn't have anywhere to land. Loss didn't always arrive as a sharp event. Sometimes it lingered like this leaf refusing to fall when everything else already had. Susan had learned to live alongside that kind of absence. The quiet seat at the table. The extra mug she no longer needed. The way evenings stretched longer now. She didn't push the feeling away. She let it rest the same way she let the night settle around her. The leaf rustled once, then stilled again. There was something oddly comforting about it. Not the holding on, but the patience. The leaf wasn't fighting gravity. It wasn't resisting change with effort. It was simply still there for now. Susan thought about all the endings she had feared when she was younger. The ones she imagined would break her. The ones she thought she wouldn't survive. Most of them hadn't come the way she expected. And when they did come, they didn't erase her. They rearranged her life quietly, slowly, until she learned how to stand in the new shape. She sat down on the porch chair, the wood creaking beneath her weight. The sound felt familiar, grounding. She watched her breath fog faintly in the cooler air, then disappear. Impermanence, she knew, wasn't a threat. It was a rhythm. Everything entered, everything left. Even the things that stayed longer than expected eventually followed the same pattern. Still knowing something and feeling ready for it were different things. Susan closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the crickets, the distant sound of a car passing somewhere far away. The night didn't hurry the leaf. It didn't insist on anything. When she opened her eyes again, the leaf was still there. She smiled at that. Not because she needed it to stay forever, but because it was allowed to stay as long as it did. Some endings don't need to be forced. Some beginnings don't announce themselves. Sometimes life simply waits until everything is ready. Susan leaned back, letting the chair support her, letting the quiet do its work. The leaf would fall when it fell, or it wouldn't. Either way, the tree already knew how to grow again. The leaf stayed through the night. Susan noticed it again in the morning light, still holding on, still quiet. Frost traced a thin line along the railing, and the air carried that clean, almost metallic chill that came just before winter settled in. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt unfinished. She made her tea and stood by the window while it steeped, watching the branch sway gently. The leaf moved with it, now less rigid than before. as if it had loosened its grip without letting go entirely. Susan didn't wonder when it would fall anymore. The question had softened into something less sharp. She was more curious about how it stayed present in this in-between moment, not fully alive, not yet gone. That space felt familiar. So much of her life now existed there, between who she had been and who she was becoming. Between the roles she once filled and the quieter ones she was learning to accept. Between holding and releasing. She carried her tea out to the porch again, the mug warming her hands. The chair creaked in the same place as the night before. The sound reassured her that some things at least were consistent. The leaf trembled once in a breeze that barely deserved the name. It turned slightly, catching the light. For a second, its veins glowed faintly like a map no one needed to read anymore. Susan felt no urgency rise in her chest. No need to intervene. No need to wish for anything to happen faster. Loss had taught her that endings didn't require her permission. They arrived when they arrived. And beginnings, she had learned, were often too quiet to notice at first. She thought of the library she would leave behind in a few months, the shelves that would still hold their weight, the readers who would come and go without knowing her name. It no longer felt like erasure. It felt like continuity. The leaf shifted again. Then, without ceremony, it let go. There was no sound when it fell, no dramatic motion. It drifted downward in a slow, uneven path, turning once then again before resting on the ground beneath the tree. Susan watched without flinching. Something inside her loosened, not in grief, but in recognition. This was how it happened. This was how it always happened. Not with force, but with timing. She stayed where she was, breathing evenly, allowing the moment to complete itself without adding a story to it. The tree stood bare now, unremarkable, ready for its next quiet season. In a few months, new leaves would appear without asking whether the old ones had been missed. Susan finished her tea. The warmth spread through her chest, steady and kind. She set the mug down and rested her hands in her lap, palms open, fingers relaxed. Change, she realized, didn't mean disappearance. It meant movement. It meant making room. The fallen leaf would return to the earth. The tree would use what remained. Nothing was wasted. She stood up and went back inside, leaving the porch as it was. The day would unfold on its own. There was nothing she needed to carry forward from the night before. Impermanence wasn't a loss of ground. It was the ground itself, always shifting, always supporting the next step. And as the morning light grew a little brighter, Susan felt ready to move with it slowly, without fear, trusting the quiet intelligence of change. Jason didn't tell anyone he was thinking about quitting. Not because he was ashamed exactly. More because he didn't have the energy for the conversations that would follow. The encouragement, the advice, the well-meaning questions that sounded like pressure. He could already hear the phrases people used when they wanted to help. Don't give up. You're almost there. Just push through. He was 23 at community college, trying to finish a program he'd picked because it sounded practical. Something stable. Something that would make his mom relax when she asked for the 5th time in a week how school was going. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed in a small apartment he shared with 2 roommates who were both out late. The place was quiet in a lived-in way. A faint hum from the refrigerator, the soft whoosh of the ceiling fan, the occasional pop of the heater turning on and off. His desk lamp was on, angled downward, so the rest of the room stayed dim. In front of him was a stack of papers, a course withdrawal form, a printout of his grades, and an email from the financial aid office he hadn't opened yet. The papers weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that sat in your throat. Jason picked up the withdrawal form and read the lines again, even though he already knew what it said. Name, student ID, class, signature, date. It was strange how something that could change your life could look so ordinary on paper. He put it down and reached for his phone, then stopped. He wasn't looking for distraction. He was looking for relief. But the kind of relief he usually reached for scrolling, checking, refreshing, didn't actually relieve anything. It just delayed the moment when he had to feel what he was feeling. Jason leaned back against the wall and let his head rest there. His eyes stayed open, unfocused on the dark corner of the room. He wasn't scared of failure in a loud way. He wasn't panicking. What he felt was quieter and heavier. The fear that he was stuck, that nothing in him was changing, that he'd keep trying and keep feeling like the same anxious, uncertain person who didn't know what he was doing. He'd been telling himself for months that he just needed to work harder, sleep less, focus more, be tougher. But lately, the harder he pushed, the worse he felt. Not just tired thin, like something in him was wearing down. His shoulders ached from sitting tense all day. His jaw felt tight. Even his hands resting on his knees had a slight tremble to them, like they didn't trust stillness. Jason stared at the papers again. The thought that kept returning wasn't, "I want to quit." It was, "I don't want to hurt like this anymore." And that difference mattered, even if he couldn't explain it yet. He got up and walked to the tiny kitchen. The floor was cold under his feet. He poured a glass of water and took a slow drink. The water tasted plain, almost sweet, in how uncomplicated it was. He stood there a moment, listening to the refrigerator hum. A steady sound, not asking anything from him. On the counter was a grocery store flyer one of his roommates had left behind. Most of it was ads. But on the back, there was a small picture of a butterfly, part of a spring gardening section. Jason didn't care about gardening. Still, his eyes paused there. A butterfly. Bright wings. Lightness. He thought randomly of how a caterpillar becomes one. Not the pretty part, the slow part. The part people didn't post, the part where it disappears into something tight and sealed and confusing. It wasn't a neat transformation. It was a messy one, a dissolving. Jason had seen a video once in a biology class he barely remembered of a caterpillar turning into a chrysalis. He'd expected it to look like a simple upgrade, like a costume change. Instead, it looked like an ending, like the caterpillar was giving up its shape, like it was surrendering to something it didn't understand. And then later, something new came out. Jason set the glass down and went back to his room. He didn't feel inspired. He didn't suddenly know what to do. But the image stayed with him, not the butterfly, but the chrysalis, the in-between place. Maybe that was where he was. Not failing, not succeeding, just changing. He sat down again, the withdrawal form still on the bed beside him. His fingers hovered over the paper. He didn't sign. He didn't tear it up either. He simply let it be there without forcing a decision out of himself. The ceiling fan moved the air in a slow circle, over and over, like time doing what time does. Jason exhaled longer than he meant to. The tightness in his chest softened a little, not because his problems were solved, but because he'd stopped squeezing himself for an answer. Sometimes the pain isn't punishment. Sometimes it's the skin getting too small. He didn't need to call it growth. He didn't need to call it transformation. He only needed to admit the truth of it. The old way he'd been living didn't fit anymore. And maybe the next thing wouldn't arrive through force. Maybe it would arrive through letting something end. He lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, and let his eyes close for a moment. The room stayed quiet. The papers stayed where they were. The future stayed outside the door, waiting its turn. For now, Jason was allowed to be in the in-between. Jason woke sometime later, not fully asleep, not fully awake. The room was darker now. The desk lamp had clicked itself off, and the only light came from the thin strip under the door where the hallway glowed faintly. The ceiling fan still turned slow and patient, moving the same air it had been moving all night. For a few seconds he didn't remember what time it was or what day it was. That small disorientation felt almost kind. There was no label yet, no role to step back into. His body felt heavy, but not in the exhausted way he'd grown used to. This heaviness was softer, like something settling rather than collapsing. His shoulders weren't pressed up around his ears anymore. His jaw wasn't clenched. Jason lay there and noticed his breathing. It came and went on its own without instruction. When he stopped trying to manage it, it slowed. When it slowed, his thoughts thinned out. The papers were still on the bed beside him. He could see their edges in the low light. They didn't look threatening now, they just looked unfinished. He rolled onto his side and pulled the blanket up around his shoulders. The fabric was warm, familiar. He hadn't changed clothes, but it didn't matter. Comfort didn't require preparation tonight. The image of the chrysalis returned quietly, not as an idea, not as a metaphor he needed to analyze, but as a feeling, tight, enclosed, still. Inside a chrysalis, he remembered the caterpillar doesn't simply wait. Its old body breaks down. The structures that once made sense dissolve. What emerges later isn't a repaired version of the same thing. It's something different. That part had always unsettled him. Jason had been trying to carry his old shape forward. The same expectations, the same measures of success, the same timeline everyone seemed to agree on. No wonder it hurt. No wonder he felt like he was failing at a version of life that no longer fit. Fear had told him that stopping meant falling behind, that letting something end meant losing everything. But lying there in the quiet, he could feel another truth beneath that fear. Not all endings were losses. Some were releases. He didn't need to decide tonight whether he would stay in the program or leave it. He didn't need to map out a new identity. He didn't need to become the butterfly before the night was over. The work of this moment was smaller. It was staying still long enough for the struggle to stop thrashing. Jason rested one hand on his chest and felt the warmth there. A steady presence. Proof that something in him was still working, still alive, still responding to care. Outside, a car passed somewhere on the street, tires hissing softly against the pavement. The sound came and went without leaving a trace. The world kept moving without requiring his participation. That was a relief. He let his thoughts drift without grabbing onto them. School, work, his mom's worried face. None of them needed his attention right now. They could wait outside the cocoon of this night. Change didn't feel like excitement. It felt like quiet, like not having to explain himself to anyone, even to himself. Jason's breathing grew slower. His body sank deeper into the mattress. The boundary between thought and rest softened like the edges of a picture losing focus. The caterpillar didn't rush its becoming. It didn't argue with the process. It didn't demand proof that something better was coming. It simply allowed the old form to end. Jason felt his eyelids grow heavy again. This time he didn't resist it. He didn't try to stay alert. He didn't tell himself to sleep. He just let go of the need to be anything other than what he was in this moment. Not finished, not broken, just changing. The night held him without questions. The room stayed dark and steady. Somewhere inside the quiet, something new was already forming, unseen, unhurried, exactly on time. Nina didn't plan to garden that afternoon. She'd only stepped into her tiny backyard to take out the trash, still wearing her daycare t-shirt with a cartoon sun on the front. The day had been one long stretch of small hands and loud feelings, kids melting down over the wrong cup, the wrong snack, the wrong crayon. By the time she got home, her patience felt used up in the same quiet way a phone battery dies. Not dramatic, just suddenly red. The air outside was warm, but not sticky. The kind of late-day light that makes everything look softer than it felt. Nina paused near the fence and noticed a cluster of weeds pushing up along the edge of the garden bed. Thin stems, stubborn leaves, little green flags claiming space. She stared at them longer than she needed to, because that's what anger does sometimes. It finds a harmless target. She told herself, I should pull those. It'll take 5 minutes. It'll feel productive. She went inside, washed her hands, and came back out with a pair of gardening gloves she'd bought months ago and barely used. When she slid them on, the fabric felt stiff and new. Like it didn't know her yet, she crouched near the weeds and gripped the first one, hard tugging straight up. It snapped. The top came off in her hand, while the rest stayed buried in the dirt. Nina's jaw tightened. She grabbed another and pulled even harder. Snap again. 2 clean breaks like the weeds were making a point. Of course, she muttered, more annoyed than the situation deserved. Nina was 35, and most people would describe her as calm, soft-spoken, good with kids, the kind of person who could talk a 3-year-old down from a full-body tantrum with a quiet voice and a silly song. But there was a version of her no one saw at work, a version that showed up later in the car, in the shower, or here alone in her backyard with dirt under her nails. That version was tired, and when she was tired, anger didn't look like shouting. It looked like tension. It looked like replaying the same moment over and over. It looked like holding a grudge against someone who probably wasn't even thinking about her anymore. Earlier that day, a coworker had said something small and sharp in the staff room. Not a scream, not a fight. Just a comment thrown casually the way people do when they're stressed and don't notice where their words land. Nina had laughed it off at the time, smiled, changed the subject. But the sentence followed her home like a burr stuck to her sleeve. Now crouched in the dirt, she realized she was pulling weeds the same way she'd handled that moment, trying to remove the visible part without touching what was underneath. Keep it neat. Keep it quiet. Don't make a scene. She stared at the broken stems in her gloved hand. The roots were still down there untouched, holding firm. Nina shifted her weight and tried again, this time with a different grip. She pinched closer to the base, right where the plant met the soil. She loosened the dirt around it with her fingers, slow and careful. The earth was slightly damp, cool under the surface. She felt the plant give a little, then stop, then give again. When it finally came out, it brought a thin root with it, longer than she expected, pale and wiry, like a little cord. Nina held it up and stared, a little surprised. It wasn't the weed that was strong. It was the root. She sat back on her heels and looked at the rest of the patch. If she kept snapping the tops off, she could clear the surface quickly, sure. But the weeds would come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but they'd return quietly, stubbornly, because the real part of them was still there. She knew that feeling. Anger, when she tried to be mature, didn't go away. It just went underground. It waited. It resurfaced later as sarcasm, as coldness, as a tight chest at night when she was trying to sleep. She pulled another weed, slow this time, loosening the soil first. It came out clean, root and all. The motion felt different in her body. Less force, more patience, more honesty. She thought about the co-worker's comment again, and for the first time she asked herself a question she usually avoided. What did that actually touch? Not the words themselves, the place they landed. Because the truth was, Nina's anger wasn't only about that one comment. The comment was just the top. Underneath it was a root, the feeling of not being respected, of being the one who always stayed late, the one who always cleaned up, the one who always said yes because she didn't want to be difficult, and then quietly resented everyone for expecting it. That was the root. Nina didn't judge herself for it. She didn't lecture herself about boundaries or communication. She just noticed it the way she was noticing the roots in her hand, thin but persistent, stretching farther than the surface suggested. A breeze moved through the yard. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's sprinkler clicked on. The sound was steady, rhythmic, almost like a metronome. Nina kept pulling weeds one at a time, slower than she'd planned. And as she worked, she could feel the anger shifting, not disappearing, not turning into forgiveness on the spot, just changing texture. When she snapped the tops off, her anger felt sharp and urgent, like it needed to be acted on, like it needed to win, like it needed to do something. When she eased the roots out, her anger felt more like information, like a signal, like a part of her that was saying quietly, "You've been holding too much." Nina paused and rested her gloved hands on her thighs. She looked at the small pile of weeds beside her roots, exposed, no longer hidden. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. She realized something else too. Trimming the top had always been easier, faster, cleaner. It made her look calm. It kept her image intact. But pulling the root, naming what hurt, admitting what she needed, that was the part she avoided. Not because she didn't know how, because it made things feel messy for a minute. And Nina had spent most of her life trying not to be messy. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff. She brushed dirt from her gloves and looked at the garden bed. It wasn't perfect. There were still weeds. There always would be. Life kept growing things, some of them helpful, some of them not. But she could already tell the ones she'd pulled from the root weren't coming back the same way. She gathered the weeds into a small paper bag. The bag crinkled softly in her hands. As she walked toward the trash bin, she felt her shoulders lower just a fraction. A tiny release. Not a dramatic breakthrough, not a speech, just a quiet understanding that sometimes anger isn't asking you to explode. Sometimes it's asking you to go deeper. And Nina, still tired, still human, still carrying the day on her skin, felt a little more willing to do that slowly, one root at a time. Nina didn't finish pulling all the weeds that day. She tied the paper bag loosely and left it by the back door, meaning to take it out later. The garden bed looked uneven now, some spots clear, others still crowded with green. It wasn't the neat before and after she usually preferred, and somehow that felt right. Inside, she rinsed her hands at the sink. Bits of dirt swirled away and disappeared, leaving her fingers clean, but a little tired. She noticed how the tension in her shoulders had eased without her telling it to. No deep breathing, no fixing, just less holding. That evening, as she folded laundry on the couch, the moment from work came back again. The comment, the tone, the way she'd smiled and swallowed her response. But this time, the memory didn't flare. It arrived quietly, like a weed she already recognized. She didn't push it away. She asked the same question again, gently. "What's the root here?" The answer didn't come as words right away. It came as a feeling in her chest. Tight, familiar. The feeling of being overlooked, of being the one who adapts so others don't have to, of being kind and hoping, maybe unfairly, that kindness would be noticed without being named. Nina let herself feel that for a moment. Not the anger on top, but the tiredness underneath. It was heavier, but also truer. And strangely, it didn't demand action. It just wanted to be seen. The washing machine clicked off. The sudden quiet filled the room. Nina stacked the towels, slowly aligning the edges without thinking too hard about it. Ordinary movements had a way of making space for things to settle. Anger, she realized, often comes from something reasonable, a need that's gone unspoken, a boundary that's been crossed too many times. When she cut it down at the surface, telling herself to be nice or let it go, that need stayed buried, still growing. That night, lying in bed, Nina didn't rehearse an argument. She didn't plan a confrontation. She didn't decide what she would say the next day. She simply noticed that she felt less tight than usual. Her breathing found its own rhythm. In and out. Slower than earlier, without effort. The house made its nighttime sounds, pipes settling, a distant car passing, the soft tick of the clock in the hall. She thought about the garden again. How pulling the root took more patience, more time, and dirtier hands. How it also meant the weed didn't have to be fought again tomorrow. Not everything in her life needed to be resolved right away. Some things just needed to be acknowledged at the right depth. The next morning, Nina stood at the staff room counter pouring herself coffee. The coworker was there too, scrolling on her phone. Nothing dramatic happened. No apology, no repeat of yesterday. But Nina noticed something different in herself. When the coworker spoke, Nina didn't brace. She didn't shrink. She didn't smile automatically. She just listened, shoulders relaxed, attention steady. The anger that had been buzzing under her skin the day before wasn't gone. But it wasn't driving anymore. It had become information. Later, during nap time at the daycare, the room was dim and quiet. Small bodies rose and fell on their mats. Nina sat in her chair, hands resting loosely in her lap. She felt tired but not depleted. There's a difference. Exhaustion that comes from giving too much feels sharp, resentful. The tiredness she felt now was softer, honest. The kind that comes from doing the work that actually matters. That afternoon, when she got home, Nina stepped into the backyard again. The weeds she'd left were still there, of course. Life didn't rearrange itself overnight. She pulled one more slowly, feeling the soil loosen, the roots slide free. She didn't rush to finish. She didn't aim for perfect. Anger, she understood now, doesn't need to be cut down or crushed. It needs to be understood at the level it grows. Above that, everything is just maintenance. As dusk settled in, Nina left the garden as it was and went inside. The paper bag still waited by the door. The work could continue another day. For now, it was enough to know where the roots were. In bed, as the room darkened and the day finally released its grip, Nina felt her thoughts slow. Nothing needed to be solved tonight. Nothing needed to be pushed away. Some things, once seen clearly, stopped demanding so much energy. And with that, the mind, like the garden, was allowed to rest. The coffee machine made a tired sound as it finished brewing. Brian stood at the counter of the gas station, one hand on the lid of a paper cup, the other resting on the edge of the sink. It was late enough that the place felt hollow. No line, no rush. Just the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional car passing outside, tires hissing on the road. He added cream without really looking, snapped the lid on, and pressed it down until it clicked. The sound was small, final. He lifted the cup, felt the heat through the cardboard sleeve, and took a careful sip. Too hot. Brian winced, slightly more annoyed than hurt. He blew across the opening, watching steam curl up and disappear. It reminded him of how anger behaves, how it rises fast, looks dramatic for a second, and then vanishes into the air, leaving something else behind. He was 29 in EMT, and he knew more about bodies than he ever planned to. He knew how quickly things could go wrong, how pain traveled, how stress hid itself until it didn't anymore. What he didn't know, what no training had prepared him for, was how to deal with anger that had nowhere to go. The shift had been long, not unusually long, just heavy. Calls that blurred together, a patient who yelled, a family member who blamed him for something he couldn't control, a supervisor who brushed it off with a quick, "You did what you could," and moved on. Brian nodded at the time. Of course he did. He always did. But the anger didn't clock out with him. Now it sat in his chest, tight and sour, like something swallowed too fast. He leaned against the counter and stared at the dark window. His reflection hovered there, distorted by the glass and the glare of fluorescent lights. He looked older than he felt, or maybe more tired than he wanted to admit. There was a phrase he'd heard once, years ago, from a medic who'd been on the job too long to sugarcoat things. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to get sick. At the time, Brian had nodded politely and forgotten it. Tonight, with the cup warm in his hand, the phrase came back with uncomfortable clarity. He took another sip, slower this time. The coffee had cooled just enough to be drinkable. Bitter. He considered adding sugar, then decided against it. The bitterness felt honest. Anger often disguises itself as strength, as clarity, as righteousness. It tells you you're right to feel this way. That the heat in your chest is proof of something important. But Brian could feel what it was actually doing. It was draining him. Not all at once. Gradually, like a leak you don't notice until the tank is empty. He paid at the register, nodded to the cashier, and stepped back outside. The night air hit his face cool and clean. He took a deeper breath without meaning to. The gas station lights cast a wide, pale circle on the pavement. Beyond that, everything dissolved into dark. Brian leaned against his car and took another sip. The coffee tasted different out here, less sharp. Or maybe his mouth had adjusted. Anger doesn't always want action. Sometimes it just wants attention. It wants to be replayed, reheated, kept warm so it doesn't fade. Brian replayed the moment again, the words that had landed wrong, the look on the family member's face, the way his supervisor had already turned away. Each replay tightened his jaw a little more. His shoulders crept up. His grip on the cup grew firmer. And suddenly, he noticed his hand. How hard he was squeezing. He loosened his fingers just a bit. The cup didn't fall. Nothing bad happened. The coffee stayed right where it was. He let out a breath. Brian wasn't ready to forgive anyone. That word felt too big, too clean, too far away from how he actually felt. Forgiveness sounded like letting someone off the hook, and he wasn't interested in that. What he was interested in, what his body seemed to be asking for, was relief. The kind that comes from not swallowing something harmful just to keep a story alive. He finished the coffee slowly, noticing the warmth move through him. When the cup was empty, he crushed it lightly in his hand and tossed it into the trash. The sound it made was dull, unremarkable. He sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. The dashboard lights glowed softly. The radio stayed off. There was no need for noise. Brian rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield. The anger was still there. He could feel it. But it no longer felt like fuel. It felt like weight. And for the first time that night, he wondered quietly without judgment how much of that weight he was willing to keep carrying. Not for justice, not for principle, just out of habit. The engine started. The car idled. The night waited. Brian didn't drive right away. The engine idled, a low, steady sound, like a reminder that movement was available, but not required. He watched the dashboard lights glow and dim as his eyes adjusted. Outside, a semi passed on the road, the air shifting briefly, then settling again. Anger has a way of convincing you that it needs to stay hot, that if it cools something important, will be lost. Brian knew that feeling well. In his line of work, alertness mattered. Edge mattered. Letting things slide felt dangerous, like lowering your guard at the wrong moment. But sitting there, hands resting on the wheel, he could feel the difference between readiness and tension. One kept you awake, the other just wore you down. He pulled out of the station and drove a few blocks before turning onto a quieter street. Streetlights appeared at regular intervals, pools of light separated by darkness. The rhythm was predictable calming. He matched his speed to it without thinking. At a red light, Brian's mind reached for the scene again. The raised voice, the accusation, the way his chest had tightened. But this time the memory didn't grab him as hard. It was there, but it felt flatter, like a photograph instead of a live feed. He noticed something else too. Each time he replayed it, his body reacted first. The jaw, the shoulders, the shallow breath. The anger wasn't living in the story, it was living in the muscles that held the story in place. The light turned green. He kept driving. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from anger you can't express. It doesn't burn out quickly. It simmers. It keeps the nervous system on standby long after the moment has passed. Brian felt that exhaustion now, deeper than the end-of-shift fatigue he was used to. He pulled into his driveway and turned the engine off. The sudden quiet was noticeable, but not jarring. He sat for a moment longer, listening to the metal tick softly as it cooled. Inside the house, he didn't turn on many lights, just the small one near the sink. He set his keys down, washed his hands, and watched the water run clear. The simple act grounded him more than he expected. Warm water, soap, rinse, dry. Anger often asks to be justified. It wants a verdict, a winner. Brian didn't give it that tonight. He gave it space. He moved through his evening routine without rushing, changing clothes, opening a window slightly, letting the cooler air move through the room. His body responded before his thoughts did. The tightness in his chest eased a notch. His breathing lengthened. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and waited for the usual replay to begin. It didn't. Not right away. When the memory finally surfaced, it came without the sharp edge. He saw the faces involved. He saw himself. He saw the limits of what he could have done. There was a strange relief in that. Not because it excused anyone, not because it made the situation fair, but because it stopped demanding that he suffer on someone else's behalf. The phrase returned again, drinking poison and waiting for the other person to get sick. This time it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a description of a habit he no longer needed. Forgiveness, Brian realized, didn't have to mean approval. It didn't have to mean forgetting. It didn't even have to involve the other person. It could simply mean refusing to keep taking the poison. As the room darkened and the sounds of the neighborhood softened, Brian felt his body settle into the mattress. The anger hadn't vanished. It might return tomorrow or the next day or the next difficult call. But tonight, it wasn't in charge. His breath slowed. His thoughts lost their urgency. The mind, no longer fed by heat, began to cool on its own. Somewhere between one breath and the next, the day loosened its grip, and the body, no longer carrying something toxic, was finally allowed to rest. Sophia stayed longer than she needed to. The classroom was empty, the hallway lights outside already dimmed to their evening setting. Most of the building had that after-hours quiet. No footsteps, no kids' voices, just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional click from somewhere down the hall as the building settled. She stood by her desk with her tote bag still on her shoulder, staring at the whiteboard like it might tell her what to do with the feeling that had been following her all day. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even loud anger. It was disappointment. The kind that sits behind your ribs and makes everything feel heavier than it should. Sophia was 30, an elementary school teacher, and she had learned how to keep her face calm even when her heart felt bruised. A classroom demanded steadiness. Kids could sense it the way animals sense weather. If she carried too much tension, they carried it too. So she smiled when she had to. She kept her voice warm. She did the lesson. She cleaned the glue sticks off the tables. She reminded a kid for the 4th time to stop chewing on the eraser. She managed. But in the quiet, when the room finally belonged to no one, the feeling returned with more clarity. It started with a message. Just one line on her phone earlier that morning. A parent email, polite on the surface, sharp underneath. The kind of message that reads like concern, but feels like accusation. It wasn't the first time. But today it landed differently. Sophia had stared at her screen in the teacher's lounge, coffee in hand, and felt something heat up in her chest. Not because the parent was entirely wrong, not because she was guilty, but because she was tired of being doubted by people who didn't see the whole day. She typed a response 3 times, deleted it 3 times. Finally, she wrote something short and professional and careful, the kind of email that takes all the emotion out of your body and turns it into safe sentences. Then she went on with her day, like nothing happened. Now, standing in the empty classroom, she could feel the leftover heat in her throat. The words she didn't say. The urge to defend herself. The urge to be seen. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. The sky was a pale gray blue clouded over in a way that didn't look like rain, but didn't look like clear weather either. The sun wasn't visible. Still, the light was there, spread out, muted, filling everything without a direct source. Sophia remembered something her grandmother used to say when she was a kid. The sun is always there. Clouds just cover it for a while. Back then, Sophia thought it was just about weather. Now she understood it as something else too. When she was angry at someone, the anger became the only thing she could see. It colored the entire person. It turned one moment into a full identity. One email into a whole story. They don't respect me. They think I'm careless. They're looking for a reason to blame me. And maybe there was some truth in that. Or maybe it was just the cloud doing what clouds do, blocking the sun, making the world feel darker than it actually was. Sophia turned back toward her desk. Her hands moved without thinking. She straightened a stack of worksheets, aligned the corners, put a marker back in its tray. Small actions, tidy actions. Actions that made sense when the mind didn't. She tried to be honest with herself softly. She wasn't only angry at the parent, she was angry at the whole system that made teachers feel like they were always on trial. The endless pressure to prove you're doing enough. The way a single complaint could make you question months of effort. And under that anger was something even quieter fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of not being good enough, fear that one day someone would be right. Sophia sat down in her chair and let her tote bag slide to the floor. The strap made a small thump against the desk leg. She exhaled long and slow, like her body had been waiting for permission to do that all day. She thought about the parent again, about the kid actually. The kid who had smiled at her during reading time. The kid who brought her a dandelion from the playground and said it was for luck. The kid who sometimes came to school a little too hungry, a little too quiet. Sophia didn't know what was happening at home. She didn't know what kind of day the parent had. She only knew what the email had sounded like. And the email had made a cloud that was now sitting in her chest. She didn't need to excuse it. She didn't need to pretend it was fine. She just needed to remember something important. A cloud is not the sky. A cloud is not the sun. A cloud is a passing thing. Sophia reached for the light switch near the door and clicked off one row of fluorescent lights. The room dimmed slightly. She clicked off another. The hum softened. The classroom became gentler, less sharp around the edges. In the lower light, the whiteboard looked less demanding. The desks looked more like quiet furniture than stations of responsibility. The whole room felt like it was exhaling with her. Sophia stood by the door for a moment, hand on the switch, and let the last bit of heat in her body settle. The email would still be there tomorrow. The story would still be there if she wanted to pick it up again. But tonight she didn't want to carry it home. Not the cloud. Not the storm she could make out of it. She turned off the final lights, locked the classroom, and stepped into the hallway where the building felt cool and calm. The sun, she reminded herself as she walked, hadn't gone anywhere. It was just behind something for a while. Sophia didn't check her phone on the drive home. It sat face down in the cup holder, silent dark. She noticed the urge to reach for it anyway, just to see if anything else had come in. Just to confirm the story hadn't changed. She let the urge pass. The road ahead was familiar streetlights, spaced evenly, each one appearing and disappearing at a steady pace. Her shoulders dropped a little as she drove. At home, she left her shoes by the door and didn't turn on the overhead lights. A small lamp in the living room was enough. The apartment felt still in that end-of-day way, like it had been waiting patiently for her to arrive and stop moving. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window while she drank. Outside, the sky had darkened completely now. The clouds were still there, she could tell, but they'd blended into the night. Nothing dramatic. Just layers of gray moving slowly, doing what they do. Anger has a habit of overstating its case. It takes a moment and stretches it into a verdict. It takes one interaction and uses it to explain an entire person. Sophia could feel how easily she'd slipped into that earlier, how the email had begun to stand in for the parent, for the relationship, for the whole year. But now, with the day at a distance, the feeling had changed shape. It wasn't gone. It just wasn't loud. She sat on the couch and let herself sink into the cushion. Her body felt tired in a clean way, the kind that comes after holding a lot and finally setting some of it down. She rested her hands on her lap and noticed how warm they were, how steady. The image returned to her, not the email, not the words, but the sky from earlier. The way the light had still filled everything, even without a visible sun. She thought about the parent again, but differently this time. Not as an antagonist, not as a character in a story, just as a person likely tired in their own way, worried in the way parents often are, when they don't know how else to be. This didn't make the email okay. It didn't erase the sting, but it softened the edges. Forgiveness, Sophia realized, didn't have to be a feeling she summoned. It didn't have to be warm or generous or complete. It could be as simple as refusing to let one cloud decide the weather forever. She wasn't forgiving the behavior. She was forgiving the moment, its power. Later, as she got ready for bed, Sophia caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face looked calmer than it had that morning. Not happier, just less tight. She brushed her teeth slowly, unhurried, watching the familiar movements. When she lay down, the apartment made its quiet nighttime sounds, the faint hum of the fridge, the soft creak of the building settling. She pulled the blanket up and exhaled long and even. The email drifted through her mind once more, lighter now, like a thought passing through open air. She didn't follow it. She didn't push it away. She let it move on its own. Somewhere between one breath and the next, she understood something simple and steady. People are not their worst moments, and neither are we. Anger can make it feel otherwise. It can convince you that what you're seeing is the whole truth. But anger, like weather, changes. It moves. It thins. The sun doesn't need defending. It doesn't need arguing. It just waits. Sophia's breathing slowed as the room grew darker. The day loosened its hold. Tomorrow would come with its own clouds, its own light. She didn't need to solve any of that now. For tonight, it was enough to rest in the knowing that clarity returns on its own when we stop staring at the sky and demanding it be different. Some things pass best when they're allowed to. Some mornings don't arrive with energy. They arrive quietly, almost shy, like they're not sure if anyone is ready for them yet. Tyler was already awake when the light started to thin the darkness between the trees. He hadn't set an alarm. He rarely did on days like this. As a park ranger, his schedule shifted with the seasons, with weather, with things that didn't care much about clocks. That morning he stood on a narrow trail just before sunrise, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, breath visible for a moment and then gone. The forest was still. Not silent exactly, but waiting. The kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. Tyler took a few slow steps forward, boots pressing into damp soil. Somewhere above him, a bird began to sing. Just one. A thin, clear sound, unhurried, unafraid of being heard or not heard. It didn't repeat itself for effect. It didn't pause to see if anyone was listening. It simply sang the way it always did because that was what it did when the morning came. Tyler stopped walking. He hadn't meant to. His body just did it on its own. He stood there, head tilted slightly, listening. Another bird joined in, then another, each with its own rhythm, its own tone. None of them tried to match the others. None of them waited for permission. They weren't performing. They weren't proving anything. They weren't hoping for applause. They were just being birds. Tyler felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was tight. It wasn't a dramatic release, no wave of emotion, just a subtle shift, like when you unclench your jaw after holding it all night. Lately, he'd been carrying a quiet question around with him, one he didn't talk about much. It showed up when he scrolled through his phone at night, when he heard old friends talk about promotions or big moves or what's next. The question wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Am I doing enough? Enough on paper. His life was fine. Steady job, decent health, a small apartment close to the park. He liked his work. He believed in it. But sometimes, especially in moments of comparison, that didn't seem to count for much. The world was loud about success, about recognition, about being seen. And Tyler wasn't sure where someone like him fit into that noise. Another bird sang closer this time. Tyler smiled, almost without realizing it. Not because the sound was impressive, but because it was honest. The bird wasn't trying to be louder than the rest of the forest. It wasn't trying to stand out. It was simply responding to the morning. Tyler thought about how often he did the opposite. How often he checked to see if what he was doing mattered before he let himself enjoy it. How often he measured his days by reaction instead of by presence. How many times he'd waited for someone else to notice before he allowed himself to feel okay about where he was. The bird didn't wait. It sang again, the same simple phrase, as if nothing else in the world required its attention. Tyler leaned against a nearby tree, the bark cool through his jacket. He closed his eyes for a moment. The forest continued without him. The light shifted. The air moved. Nothing stopped just because he did. There was something oddly comforting about that. He realized that the birds weren't singing for the forest. They were singing from themselves, from whatever instinct or joy or necessity lived inside them. They didn't seem concerned with how their song landed. They didn't adjust their pitch to be more likable. They didn't question whether they deserved to be heard. They sang because singing was part of being alive. Tyler took a slow breath in, then out. The breath felt easier than it had earlier, like it didn't have to pass through as many tight places to get out. He thought about the small things he loved that no one ever clapped for. Early mornings like this, fixing trail signs, watching fog lift off the ground, listening to the woods wake up. None of it earned praise, none of it went online, but it filled something real in him. Maybe value didn't have to be loud. Maybe it didn't have to be proven. Maybe it didn't even have to be witnessed. Another song rose from the trees, then faded naturally without a dramatic ending. No grand finale, just a soft return to quiet. Tyler opened his eyes. The sky was lighter now, not bright yet, but changing. He straightened up, brushed his hands together, and took a step forward on the trail. The birds continued behind him, unconcerned with whether he stayed or went. As he walked, the question that had been following him didn't disappear completely, but it felt less heavy, less demanding, like it didn't need an answer right now. He didn't need to sing louder. He didn't need to wait for approval. He just needed to keep moving through his own morning at his own pace, and somehow that felt like enough for now. Tyler kept walking as the light slowly spread between the trees. The trail curved gently ahead, familiar, but never boring. He'd walked it hundreds of times in different weather, different moods, different versions of himself. It always looked slightly new anyway. The birds were still singing, though, not all at once anymore. One would call out then, another leaving small pockets of quiet in between. The pauses felt just as important as the sound itself. Nothing rushed to fill them. Tyler noticed how his steps had fallen into an easy rhythm. Not forced, not measured, just moving. His shoulders dropped a little more with each breath, as if his body was remembering something it had forgotten during the week. He thought about how often he'd treated his own life like a performance, even when no one was watching. How he'd edited himself internally, adjusting tone and pace, wondering how things looked from the outside. It was exhausting, living as if there were always an audience somewhere beyond the trees. The birds didn't live that way. They didn't ask if the forest approved of their song. They didn't replay it later, wondering if they could have done it better. They didn't compare themselves to the bird 3 branches over. They sang. And when they were done, they stopped. Tyler slowed and sat on a fallen log near the edge of the trail. The wood was cool and slightly damp solid beneath him. He rested his elbows on his knees and let his gaze soften, not focused on anything in particular. The forest continued its quiet work around him. There was something healing about realizing that his worth didn't have to be constantly reaffirmed, that he didn't need to earn the right to exist comfortably in his own life. He could just be here, breathing, listening, taking up space without apology. He hadn't always believed that. Growing up, praise had come with conditions. Do well, be useful, make sense to other people. Over time, he'd learned to translate attention into value silence, into doubt. If no one was responding, maybe he wasn't doing enough. Maybe he needed to try harder. But the forest offered no feedback like that. It didn't reward or withhold. It simply allowed everything to exist in its own way. Tall trees, small birds, quiet mornings, all of it counted. Tyler felt a small smile touch his face again. Not because he'd figured something out, but because he didn't feel the need to figure anything out anymore. The pressure to define himself softened the way fog lifts without being pushed. A bird landed on a nearby branch close enough for Tyler to hear the flutter of wings. It stayed for a moment, then lifted off again. No drama, no attachment, just motion. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the sounds layer over one another, the birds, the wind, his own breathing. Each sound arrived, stayed, and moved on. None of them asked to be held. When he opened his eyes, the morning felt fully present now. Light had reached the forest floor. Colors had returned. Tyler stood brushing dirt from his hands and continued down the trail. As he walked, a thought surfaced, simple and unforced. Maybe I don't need to be seen to be real. It wasn't a declaration, just a quiet noticing. The birds kept singing behind him, not concerned with whether he remembered them later. They weren't building a case for their importance. They were living it moment by moment, without explanation. Tyler reached the point where the trail split. He paused, then chose the left path, the one that dipped slightly before rising again. He didn't analyze the choice. It just felt right. The forest held him as he moved forward. No spotlight, no applause, no judgment. Just the steady presence of something larger where every small voice had its place. By the time the trail opened up near the ranger station, the birds had quieted. The morning had moved on. Tyler felt ready to move with it. He didn't feel suddenly confident or transformed. He didn't feel certain about everything ahead. But he felt settled, like something inside him had found its natural pitch again. Not too loud, not too small, just true to itself. And that he realized was enough. By late afternoon, the porch was already half in shadow. Grace sat on the wooden swing with a thin cardigan pulled around her shoulders. Not because it was cold, but because the day had begun to let go of its warmth. The air carried that quiet feeling that comes just before evening, when nothing urgent is left to do, and the world doesn't expect much from you anymore. The swing moved slightly as she shifted her weight. Not enough to creak loudly, just a soft, familiar motion. Back and forth, back and forth. A rhythm she didn't think about until it was already happening. Across the yard stood the oak tree. It had been there longer than Grace had lived in the house, longer than her children had lived there, longer than most of the things that once felt important. Its trunk was thick and uneven, the bark rough and darkened with age. In the summer, it filled the yard with shade. In the winter, it stood bare and unremarkable, easy to overlook. Grace had noticed recently how people tended to overlook her too. It wasn't dramatic. No one was being cruel. It was quieter than that. Conversations moved around her instead of toward her. New ideas came from younger voices. Invitations arrived less often. When people spoke to her, it was with kindness, but also with a subtle assumption that her most active chapters were already behind her. She told herself it was fine. She had a good life, a steady routine, a job she'd done well for years. But sometimes, usually in moments like this, the thought would surface without warning. Do I still matter in the way I used to? The swing rocked again. Grace rested her hands in her lap and watched the oak tree's branches stretch outward, weight and heavy. Its leaves barely moved even when the breeze picked up. The tree didn't respond to the wind the way smaller trees did. It didn't rush. It didn't flutter. It stayed. She thought about how, when she was younger, she'd believed value came from visibility, from doing more, from being noticed, from having something to show. Back then she was all branches and leaves, busy spreading, reaching outward in every direction. Now much of that had slowed. Her days were quieter, more internal, less impressive from the outside. And part of her wondered if that meant something had been lost. The oak tree didn't seem to worry about that. It didn't try to look younger than it was. It didn't apologize for the thickness of its trunk or the heaviness of its limbs. It didn't chase attention with new growth every season. It simply stood there, rooted deep, holding the ground in a way that younger trees couldn't. Grace leaned back slightly, letting the swing support her weight. The wood pressed firmly against her spine, steady and real. She felt the tiredness in her body, not the sharp kind, but the deep layered kind that comes from years of showing up. The oak tree had rings. She knew that. Layers beneath the bark, each one marking a season of growth. Stress, weather, survival. None of them visible unless the tree was cut open. None of them obvious to someone passing by. And yet those unseen layers were the reason the tree could stand the way it did. Grace exhaled slowly. The thought settled somewhere inside her, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. Maybe value didn't live in what people could see anymore. Maybe it had moved underground. She looked at her hands. The skin thinner than it used to be, veins more visible. These hands had held children books, grocery bags, grief, joy. They had done their work quietly, without needing to be admired. The swing rocked again, a little wider this time. The evening insects had started their low hum. Grace didn't turn on the porch light. She liked the half-light. It made everything softer, less defined. She thought about the younger version of herself, always reaching, always stretching toward the next thing. That version had been necessary, but it wasn't the only one that mattered. The oak tree had once been young too. Now its strength was not in how far it reached, but in how deeply it held. Grace sat with that image as the sky dimmed further. The yard grew still. The tree didn't move much at all, but somehow it felt more present than anything else around her. She didn't need to decide what this meant yet. She didn't need to turn it into a lesson or a reassurance. It was enough to notice the shift, to feel the weight of something steady beneath the surface. The swing slowed on its own. Grace let it. As the evening deepened, the air around the porch seemed to slow. The colors in the yard softened, edges blurring slightly, as if the day itself were getting ready to rest. Grace stayed where she was, letting the swing move less and less until it barely shifted at all. The oak tree remained in front of her, solid and patient. She realized she had never once worried about whether the tree was still useful. No one questioned its worth because it no longer grew quickly. No one expected it to prove anything. Its presence alone felt enough. More than enough. The shade it gave, the way it held the soil in place, the quiet sense of continuity, it all happened without asking for attention. Grace thought about how different that felt from the way people often treated themselves. How easily value became tied to output, to recognition, to how visible or impressive one appeared to be. And how, as those things naturally shifted with time, a quiet fear could slip in, whispering that something essential had been lost. The oak tree didn't seem to believe that story. Its roots were invisible, buried deep beneath the surface. They weren't admired. They weren't photographed. But they were doing the real work. Holding, nourishing, keeping the whole structure steady through storms that never made headlines. Grace placed her feet more firmly on the porch floor and let the swing come to a stop. The stillness felt kind, not empty. She noticed how her breathing had slowed, how her chest rose and fell without effort. Her body at least seemed to understand something before her thoughts did. She remembered a time years ago when she had been afraid of slowing down. Afraid that if she stopped pushing, she might disappear. That if she wasn't reaching outward, she wouldn't matter anymore. But sitting there now, she didn't feel like she was fading. She felt grounded. The oak tree had weathered seasons Grace could barely remember. Droughts, heavy rains, winters that stripped it bare. And still it stood. Not because it tried harder each year, but because it had learned how to hold itself from the inside. Grace rested her hands on the arms of the swing. The wood was smooth from years of use. Familiar, reliable. She thought about all the ways her own life had developed unseen strength through patience, through care, through simply staying when leaving would have been easier. Those things didn't show up on the surface, but they were there. The evening insects grew louder, then settled into a steady pattern. The world didn't rush her to come inside. It didn't demand reflection or resolution. It simply continued, allowing her to be part of it without effort. Grace's gaze drifted back to the oak tree one last time before the light faded completely. She didn't feel the need to compare herself to it. The image wasn't a lesson. It was a quiet companionship. A reminder that growth doesn't always look like expansion. Sometimes it looks like depth. She stood slowly, joints stiff but cooperative, and reached for the porch light. When it came on, the yard changed again, smaller, more contained. The oak tree was still there, partially lit, partially in shadow. Unbothered by the change, Grace paused, hand still on the switch. She didn't feel the urge to hold on to the moment. She didn't feel like she might lose something if she moved on. What she had noticed would stay with her the way certain understandings do not, as thoughts to repeat, but as a steadier way of standing. Inside the house, the evening waited quietly. Grace stepped in and closed the door behind her. The oak tree remained outside, rooted and patient, doing what it had always done. Not reaching for the sky anymore, not needing to be seen from far away, just holding the ground. And somehow, that felt like the truest kind of strength there was. May's hands were already dusted with flour before the rest of the city fully woke up. The bakery lights were on, soft and yellow, cutting through the early dark. The room smelled warm even before anything went into the oven. Yeast, sugar, something alive in the air. May stood at the stainless steel counter, folding dough over itself again and again, pressing, turning, feeling the texture change under her palms. She'd done this thousands of times. The motion didn't require thought anymore. Her hands knew when the dough needed more pressure, when it needed to rest. The rhythm was steady, almost quieting. Still, her mind drifted the way it often did in the early hours, when the world felt bigger than her small corner of it. Some days she felt invisible, not in a dramatic way, just small. One bakery on one street, one woman waking up before dawn to make bread most people would eat without thinking. Customers came and went. Compliments were polite. Life moved on. Occasionally, when she scrolled her phone during breaks, she saw stories of expansion. Bigger shops, louder success, people announcing milestones with confidence and certainty. And a familiar thought would slip in uninvited. What difference does one small life really make? May folded the dough again. The surface smoothed slightly under her hands. She sprinkled a little flour on the counter, watching the fine grains scatter and settle. Each one caught the light for just a second before becoming indistinguishable from the rest. She remembered a line she'd once read years ago. Something about seeing the universe in a grain of sand. At the time, it had sounded poetic, but distant, like a nice idea meant for someone else's life. Standing there now, she wondered what it had really meant. The dough resisted her slightly, then yielded. She paused, resting her palms flat, feeling the warmth begin to build beneath the surface. The transformation was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Nothing dramatic happened, just slow change guided by time and care. May moved the dough aside and reached for another bowl. As she poured ingredients together, the sound was soft and dry. Flour against metal. Quiet, unimpressive. And yet, this was how mornings began for her. Not with headlines or announcements, but with these small, repetitive acts that quietly fed people she would never fully know. She thought about how often she judged herself by scale, by how big something looked from the outside, by how many people noticed, by whether her efforts echoed beyond her immediate reach. It was easy to feel insignificant when measured that way. But the bakery didn't operate on scale. It operated on attention. If she rushed, the bread suffered. If she was careless, the texture changed. Each small choice mattered, even if no one ever traced it back to her hands. May leaned against the counter for a moment, stretching her fingers. Her joints ached slightly. A familiar, honest ache. proof of effort, even if the effort didn't come with applause. She looked at the flowers still clinging to her skin, tiny white marks against warm brown. Each grain was almost nothing on its own, easy to wipe away, easy to overlook. But together they made the dough what it was. Without them, there was no bread. The thought landed gently, not as a lesson, but as a quiet recognition. She didn't need to be vast to be essential. She didn't need to be seen by everyone to be part of something whole. May returned to her work slower now, more present. She noticed the way the dough responded to her touch, the way patience made a difference. Outside, the city began to stir. A car passed. Somewhere nearby, a door opened and closed. Inside the bakery, time felt thicker, denser, like it was holding more than usual. She shaped the dough into loaves and placed them carefully on trays. Each one slightly different, each one complete in its own way. She slid the trays onto the rack and stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. For a moment, she stood still. She thought about how the world often taught people to look outward for proof of worth, to count impact in visible results, to believe that if something didn't scale, it didn't matter. But here she was in a quiet kitchen before dawn, surrounded by small things that would soon become nourishment. Not symbolic nourishment, real nourishment. Warm bread passed from hand to hand. The oven hummed softly as it heated. May rested her palm against the metal door, feeling the warmth through her skin. She closed her eyes for just a second. If the universe could exist inside something this small, she didn't need to be afraid of her size. She just needed to keep showing up. The oven clicked softly as it reached temperature, a small sound that meant things were moving forward. May didn't rush to load the trays. She let the dough rest a little longer, trusting the pause. In baking, waiting was part of the work. Not a delay, not a mistake. Just time doing what time does best. She washed her hands at the sink, watching the flour disappear down the drain. The water ran warm, steady. As she dried her hands, she noticed how quiet the bakery still was. No customers yet, no chatter, just the low hum of machines and the faint rhythm of her own breathing. There was a strange comfort in being alone with something simple. May leaned against the counter again, eyes moving slowly around the room. The shelves, the bowls stacked neatly, the apron hanging by the door. None of it was remarkable. None of it was meant to be. And yet it all belonged together, forming a small, complete world that made sense on its own terms. She thought again about scale, about how easily the mind learned to dismiss what was small. How often more was mistaken for better, bigger reach, bigger impact, bigger proof. It was a loud way of measuring a life, and not always a gentle one. The bakery didn't ask her to be loud. It asked her to be attentive. May opened the oven door. Warm air spilled into the room, wrapping around her face and arms. She slid the trays inside one by one, careful not to jostle them. The loaves sat quietly unassuming, as if unaware of what they were about to become. She closed the door and set the timer. The waiting began again. May poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the small table near the back. She didn't scroll her phone. She didn't fill the silence. She just sat there, letting the warmth of the cup seep into her hands. A thought passed through her mind, not sharp enough to interrupt the calm, but clear enough to notice maybe being small wasn't the same as being insignificant. Maybe small was simply a different way of being whole. She watched steam rise from the tea curl and disappear. Nothing about it tried to last longer than it needed to. Nothing about it tried to be more than it was. The timer rang softly. May stood, moved back to the oven, and opened the door. The smell of bread filled the bakery, rich and grounding. She pulled the trays out and set them on the cooling rack. The loaves were golden now, firm on the outside, still settling inside. They made quiet cracking sounds as they cooled, releasing heat. May smiled. Each loaf held countless grains of flour. Each grain had disappeared into something larger without losing its role. Not erased, not wasted, just included. She thought about how people often feared being swallowed by the whole, afraid of disappearing, afraid of not standing out. But maybe there was another way to belong, one that didn't require shrinking or shouting. The bread didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need to explain its worth. It would be broken, shared, eaten. It would do exactly what it was meant to do. May cleaned the counter slowly, methodically. The motions felt easier, now less burdened by comparison. She wasn't suddenly free of doubt. She knew it would return as doubts tend to do. But it didn't feel like the final word anymore. Outside, the street began to wake up. Footsteps passed. A car door closed. Someone laughed briefly, then moved on. The world was expanding into its day. May placed the loaves in the display case and adjusted the labels. She stepped back and looked at them, not with pride exactly, but with quiet acknowledgement. This mattered. Not because it was large, but because it was real. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood still for a moment longer. The universe didn't require her to be vast. It didn't require her to be everywhere. It only asked her to be here. And in that small, warm bakery, surrounded by ordinary things, she felt something settle into place. Not certainty, not accomplishment, just a sense of belonging that didn't depend on size, like a grain of sand, holding more than it seemed. The mirror didn't flatter her. It never did. Not under that bathroom light, not this late, not after a day that had already taken too much out of her. Madison leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the edge of the sink, and stared at her own face like it belonged to someone she was still trying to understand. The apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes even small sounds feel loud. The faucet dripped once after she turned it off. Somewhere in the building, a distant door closed. The fan above her hummed softly, pulling warm air upward. Madison had spent most of the day looking at versions of herself. The version she posted. The version she replied with. The version she performed in short clips and captions, smiling at the right moments, sounding confident at the right times. She was good at it. She'd learned how to be on without it looking like effort. But now, alone in the bathroom, she felt like a phone with too many tabs open, bright heated, still running even after the work was over. She reached for a makeup wipe, dragged it across her cheek, and watched the cotton come away, slightly tinted. She did it again, slower this time. There was something calming about the motion. Simple, quiet, no audience. In the mirror, her eyes looked tired. Not just sleepy tired in the way someone gets when they've been holding themselves together all day. She tried to smile just to see. It looked strange, like a gesture borrowed from another room. She let it drop. Madison wasn't having a crisis. Nothing dramatic had happened. No breakup, no scandal, no big failure. It was smaller than that, and somehow harder to name. It was the feeling that her worth lived outside of her. In reactions, in numbers, in who noticed, in whether she was wanted, admired, approved of. And when the noise stopped, she wasn't always sure what was left. She turned the faucet on again, letting water run over her hands. The sound filled the bathroom with a steady hush. She splashed her face, then patted it dry with a towel that smelled faintly like laundry soap. Her phone buzzed from the counter. A notification. She didn't pick it up. Just let it sit there, lighting up the edge of the sink and then going dark again. For a moment, she watched herself breathe. It was such an ordinary thing to notice, but it made her feel strangely human. Not a brand, not a profile, just a person with lungs and skin and a nervous system that didn't care how many likes she got that day. Madison leaned closer to the mirror, studying a small line near her mouth she hadn't noticed a year ago. It wasn't deep, it wasn't alarming, but it made her think about time and how quietly it moves through you. A memory drifted in something her grandmother used to say when Madison was little, when she'd run to her crying over a scraped knee or a bad day at school. "Smile at yourself first," her grandmother would say, gentle but certain. "Don't wait for the world to decide if you're worth being kind to." Madison had rolled her eyes back then. It sounded like something from a greeting card. But standing here now, it didn't feel cheesy. It felt practical, like advice for surviving in a world that trains you to outsource your self-worth. She set the towel down and stared at her reflection again, this time, without scanning for flaws. She tried to look at herself the way she might look at a friend who'd had a long day. The way you look at someone you don't need to critique, someone you just want to understand. Her shoulders dropped slightly. It wasn't magical. It didn't fix anything. But it shifted something like moving a lamp so the harsh shadow softens. Madison placed one hand on the edge of the sink, grounding herself, and let the other rest on her own collarbone for just a second. The warmth of her skin under her palm felt real, immediate. Not a thought, not a story, just contact. She breathed in, then out, not as a technique, just as a permission. The phone buzzed again faintly. She ignored it again. The world could wait 2 minutes. The world could wait 10. She looked at her own eyes in the mirror. Not the whole face, not the whole image, just the eyes. They were still her eyes, even after everything. Even after the long day, the constant output, the constant comparison. Something in them was still steady. She didn't smile yet, not fully, but she softened her mouth just a little, like she was letting go of a habit she didn't need to keep holding. And in that small softening, she noticed a quiet truth. It wasn't that she needed more validation. It was that she needed to stop treating herself like someone who had to earn kindness. Madison turned off the bathroom light and left the door slightly open as she walked toward her bedroom. The hallway was dim, calm, the kind of dim that tells your brain it's safe to slow down. Behind her, the mirror stayed where it was reflecting an empty bathroom. It wasn't waiting to judge her. It wasn't asking for anything. It was just there. And for the first time all day, that felt like a relief. Madison lay back on her bed without turning on the lamp. The room was lit only by the soft glow from the streetlight outside filtered through the curtains. It wasn't dark enough to disappear into, but it was dark enough to stop inspecting everything. She rested one hand on her stomach, feeling it rise and fall. The other hand lay open beside her palm, up, fingers loose. Her body seemed to understand before her thoughts did that nothing more was required of her tonight. The day replayed itself in fragments. A comment she'd reread too many times. A moment where she'd wondered if she should have said something differently. A brief spike of relief when a post did well, followed by the quiet drop afterward. None of it arrived with the same sharpness it had earlier. It came through a layer of distance now, as if softened by the dim light. She thought again of the mirror. Not the image exactly, but the feeling of standing there without trying to fix anything. Without adjusting angles. Without searching for reassurance or bracing for disappointment. Just meeting herself as she was. That felt new. Madison realized how rarely she did that. How often she approached herself like a problem to solve a version, to improve a thing, to optimize. Even rest had become something she tried to do well, something to succeed at. But lying here with the room quiet and her phone face down on the nightstand, she felt no pull to perform. No need to curate. No one to convince. The thought came gently without insistence. I'm already here. She remembered how easy it had been earlier to place her hand on her own chest. How grounding it felt to feel warmth instead of judgment. It hadn't been dramatic. It hadn't changed her life. But it had changed the tone of the moment. Sometimes healing wasn't about breakthroughs. Sometimes it was about not adding another layer of pressure. Madison rolled slightly onto her side, tucking her knees in just enough to be comfortable. The sheets were cool. The pillow held the familiar shape of her head. Her breathing slowed, not because she told it to, but because there was space for it to do so. She thought about how long she'd been waiting for permission to feel okay. Waiting for the right response, the right reaction, the right signal from outside herself. As if peace were something that had to be handed to her by someone else. But nothing had stopped her from offering it to herself. The mirror hadn't demanded anything. It hadn't praised or criticized. It had simply reflected what was there. And what was there beneath the layers of effort and expectation was someone who was tired but still whole. Someone who didn't need to earn rest. Someone who didn't need to be impressive in order to be worthy of care. Madison felt her jaw unclench slightly. Her shoulders sank into the mattress. A small exhale left her longer than the ones before. There was no urgency to fall asleep, no goal to reach. If sleep came, it would come. If it didn't, this quiet was still enough. She imagined the mirror again now, empty, the bathroom light off. Nothing staring back. Nothing asking her to be different. Just a room at rest. Her thoughts began to drift, not in a scattered way, but in the slow, wandering way that comes before sleep. Images blurred together. The sharp edges of the day softened. Madison didn't think about tomorrow. She didn't plan. She didn't rehearse. She stayed with what was simple and present: breath, warmth, stillness. If she smiled now, it wasn't for the mirror. It wasn't for anyone at all. It was the kind of smile that happens when you stop resisting yourself. Small, private, almost imperceptible. She let it fade naturally. In the quiet, there was nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing missing. Just a person resting inside her own life. And that was enough for the night. The stories are done. The lessons are learned. There is nothing left to do. If you found peace in this sanctuary tonight, you can return here whenever you wish. We will keep the fire lit for you. If you wish to support this channel, you may leave a gentle like or subscribe so we can find each other again in the vast ocean of the internet. But now, as we move into the final space of rest, let's plant seeds of peace deep into your subconscious. Let go, drift, and let these truths become your own. My thoughts are settling like sediment in a glass of still water. Go of all ripples. The surface of my mind is becoming glass. Like a river flows to the ocean, my worries flow away from me. Obstacles without resistance. The waters of sleep are washing over my tired eyes. Floating in a sea of tranquility, weightless and free. Breath is like the tide, flowing in and flowing out. Deep below the surface waves, my inner ocean is silent. I release the day just as a leaf drifts down a stream. Cool, healing water soothes my nervous system. Merging into the velvet depths of rest. There is no need to swim. I simply float. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. Clear, transparent, and still. I am clear, transparent, and still. Transparent and still. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Water fills a cup. Water fills a cup. Fills me like water fills a cup.